First of all, just welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us here at Cranberry Mountain. My name is Matt Newberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Land Trust. Hopefully you've met the staff and we're going to introduce them in a little bit. As we're talking, feel free to move about the cabin. There is the food in the back. You can help yourself to all of that as we go along. The refreshments, and then the bathrooms are sort of through that door to the left. All of that is in the back there, so feel free to make use of all of that. But as I say, welcome. The other thing I wanted to do actually was lead off with some thanks. This is the second year that we've done this event here at Cranberry Mountain, so want to thank Julia Soper and her family for putting this event on. So a big hand for Julia and them. I don't know if Julia's still here, but and then also just to the programs committee and Brandon in particular. A lot of hands go into this event, but the programs committee in particular does a lot of the heavy lifting. So another round of applause for Brandon and his team. Thanks for that. All right. So as usual, the season is flying by, and before we know it, August will be upon us, which means kids go back to school, the days get a little shorter, and everything slows down a little. Truth be told, fall is by far my favorite season and always has been. In Maine, summer doesn't feel lazy, it feels crazy, like there's too much to do in too little time. With that said, I want to appreciate you fitting us in amidst the clam bakes, air shows, farmers markets, fireworks, boat races, cruises, ice cream cones, parades, reunions, hiking challenges, musicals, beach days, soccer matches, moonlight paddles, festivals, sunsets, bonfires, bandstand concerts, national birthday celebrations, sunrises, swims, trail walks, and lobster rolls. And by the way, the reading of the Declaration of Independence at the Old Town Meeting House last week was excellent. So tonight is part business and part pleasure. By virtue of our bylaws, we are required to gather our membership once per year to elect new trustees, approve officers, and renew terms. I was encouraged to take a minute to explain what membership means, but you're here, so maybe you already know. Or maybe it's because you got one of these, an invitation. Or maybe it's because you like to just crash a good party. Whatever applies, for the sake of clarification, Article 2 of our bylaws states what a member is, and it is anyone who makes a cash or in-kind contribution. Period. We recognize that the word membership can elicit feelings of exclusivity, maybe even elitism. However, it means quite the opposite to us. Membership is synonymous with community. There is no minimum contribution for a reason, and the Trust has always attempted to make membership accessible to all who are interested. And what, may you ask, do you get for your membership? 2 printed newsletters per year, invitations to special events, discounts on fee-based programs, and precisely 1 vote at this meeting. What a deal. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our Vice President and Chair of the Governance Committee, Judy Wallingford, to kick off the business portion of the evening.
Great, thank you, Matt. Yes, I am Judy Wallingford, Chair of the Governance Committee, and we've been busy this year preparing a slate of trustees for you to consider and a slate of officers. So I'm going to have the new trustees stand, as well as the renewing trustees and the slate of officers. All of these folks have been approved and recommended by the board to the membership for your consideration tonight. So for renewing trustees, we have John Boomer, who is being considered for, way in the back, for his 3rd 3-year term. Sharon Emeg for her 3rd 3-year term. Ed Robinson for his 2nd 3-year term. And myself, Judy Wallingford, for her 2nd 3-year term. And new trustees, Jenny Baca is right here. Yay. Brooke Barnes. Jamie Hart. Alicia Hayburn, I do not believe is here tonight, but she is one of the 5, and Sven Pulsiver. There's Sven. Great. And then finally, for the officer slate, this is a little awkward. President Judy Wallingford. You can say no, it's okay. Vice President Tim McCreight. Treasurer Ed Robinson, and Secretary Lou Hinman. Great. So for those renewing trustees, new trustees, and the slate of officers, all members in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
No, you're liar.
Yeah, all right, great. Well, thank you very much. And I am going to turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everybody. What a great group. You look terrific from up here. I have the mixed pleasure, I guess, to say a big thank you, and it's mixed because we're saying thank you to the people who are leaving us after their time on the board. I have 3 people, and it's just to explain. I think you picked this up from what Judy was saying. We're all volunteers, and the standard is a 3-year term, which can be repeated up to 3 times. So that's 9 years, and in the past, sometimes it's been even done again. So that seems like a place to start. Ron Davis. Ron, you want to come on up? Come on down. So Ron is one of the people who has been here for, tell me if I'm wrong here, I think 2 9-year terms. Yeah, sure. But as impressive as that is, he was working before he came on the board, and he's been working in between times, and he's going to keep working. If you've ever been on the trail, you've probably seen this guy before, because he practically lives there. He is responsible for lots of the good things. The Land Trust is very proud of the quality of our trails, and it doesn't happen simply. It doesn't happen for nothing. It takes true leadership, and this is a perfect example of that. So Ron, congratulations, and we have a little thank you. Next on my list, Wendy Batson, come on up. In addition to being a good friend and colleague, she is also a mentor to me. Wendy is finishing her 3rd 3-year term, so a full term of 9 years. She's been active on many committees, and including the executive committee. She is president for 3 years, and it was president when the Land Trust was going through some big changes, a new director, for instance, and staff changes. Wendy was central to all of that, and remains central. She's still active and will still be a volunteer on a committee, no longer on the board. So,
Do I get a handshake?
can we do more? Thank you, Wendy. And finally, Don, are you here? So Don Westfall is finishing his first 3-year term, so he's been 3 years with us. Been terrific, good experience, and we'll be counting on him because he's an active member and will remain an active member. So, Don, thank you so much. Right over there. Thank you, everyone.
And actually, before you go too far, Tim, there's one more thank you to make, and that is to Tim McCreight, who has served as our board president. So we want to say thank you to you and give you a little gift. Finish. Right. Moving along. Okay, thanks very much. So, I've never really been comfortable spending my time highlighting accomplishments, but I recognize that it's not only part of my job, but also part of why we do this meeting. So I will keep the bragging brief. But it's fair to say a year ago, There was some concern in our community for HHLT. After 6 months without an executive director and 3/4 of the remaining full-time staff turning over, I'd say that concern was fair. But as I stand here, I can confidently say that concern for the stability of HHLT and its long-term health would be misplaced and misinformed. Let's start the list of whys with the most important: the staff. Woo! Yeah. Exactly. So shortly after last summer's annual meeting, we filled our final vacancy, the Director of Development and Communication. And shortly after that hire, the 5 of us traveled to Cleveland for 3 days to attend the annual Land Trust Alliance National Conference known as Rally. We are standing across from our hotel, up the street from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which we spent a night hanging out in, which was really fun, and genuinely just had a wonderful time. It was formative, bonding, inspiring, and I would argue that the HHLT staff has been firing on all cylinders ever since. I am honored to lead such a talented group of professionals, and I'm grateful for their hard work and dedication to this organization. So please join me in thanking each of them now. I'll ask them to come up to the front of the room. Emma Bayless, Director of Lands and Stewardship. Lauren Dumont, Director of Development and Communications. Brandon Hall, Director of Programs. Kim Van Zorge, Operations Manager. That's like the runway. Lou Picone and Mark Ceramic are Stover's monitors. Come on down, Lou. One of our newest additions, Abby Ward, Salka Impact Land Steward. And I assume these guys are getting some well-deserved rest, as we probably all should too. But in addition, Brandon hired 5 Dynamite Nature Day Camp counselors this year, 2 of whom are putting up with my son this morning, tomorrow, and for the rest of the week. But outstanding staff. So here we go. You guys can go. So without them, the following would not have been possible. In 2025, we set our most ambitious annual fundraising goal of $350,000 and exceeded it by over $20,000. In addition, over the past year, we privately raised just over $2 million for projects including land acquisition and the building expansion. During our recent audit review with the board, our CPA firm, Purdy Powers, reported that by all metrics, HHLT is in excellent financial shape. We added 6 new trustees, bringing the total to 17, the largest in 5 years. With the incredible generosity of the family of Marguerite Kelly, we received the largest gift in HHLT's history, allowing us to add 24 acres and almost 2,500 feet of shoreline to our ranks of conserved land. Our accreditation renewal was completed, and we feel confident in October we will be awarded another 5-year term. We continued to restore our relationship with the Stovers community, thanks Lou, and received overwhelmingly positive feedback on surveys. We endured a lengthy process of proposal for the Austin Cary Forest and have been told we are the clear frontrunner for conveyance. We began our first major accessibility project on Birch Island. We relaunched Nature Day Camp as a fully state licensed summer camp with record numbers and a wait list.
And insurance.
And insurance. We secured funding for a seasonal land steward position for 2 years. We onboarded 23 new stewards that have been busy on the trails ever since. We brought back the summer cruise and spent 2 wonderful hours exploring the shores of Harpswell with a sellout crowd aboard the Casco Bay Line's Bay Mist. We launched a comprehensive strategic planning process that solicited community feedback by gathering input through in-person meetings and surveys with constituent groups. We navigated a thorough town planning board process and have finally broken ground on the building construction. The list goes on, all while tending to the general operations and ongoing stewardship work of the Trust. I think it is safe to say that we are back on track and exceeding expectations. And with the bragging behind me, I would like to close by saying thank you to all the current trustees, the staff, you, the membership, stewards, volunteers, and community supporters. I continue to be deeply inspired by the incredible conservation work we have been able to achieve. Harpswell is a special place, and this is a special organization. Thank you all. And now to introduce our guest speakers. Many of you are aware of the magical place known as Longmarsh. It is a unique, dynamic, and valuable ecosystem that's beauty is truly awe-inspiring. In days past, it was home to salt hay farming and is currently site of marsh restoration. Here to talk more about the agricultural history of salt hay farming and the lasting effects of these practices are, first, Matt Craig. Matt has spent his career in natural resource management, specializing in the protection and restoration of aquatic habitats. He currently serves as the Habitat Protection Manager for the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, a collaborative effort to conserve the ecological integrity of Casco Bay and its watershed. And Matt will be followed by Geoff Wilson, who is a founding member of the SMARTeams, a group of salt marsh researchers, managers, and practitioners who have been leaders in decoding the impacts of salt hay agriculture on salt marshes and the methods to restore them. He owns and manages Northeast Wetland Restoration and is the sanctuary manager for Bear Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. Please help me welcome Matt Craig.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I know many of you, and I've had the great pleasure of working with many of you. The Harpswell Heritage Land Trust has been a really important partner, and I certainly consider you to be a part of the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. For those of you that aren't aware, Casco Bay is roughly half of the shoreline is in Harpswell. So for that reason, and because there are so many salt marshes in Brunswick and in Harpswell, I'm up here all the time, especially during field season. In fact, I'll be coming up here tomorrow to do some work out at Long Marsh. So it's a terrific community. You have a wonderful organization, and thank you very much for having me here tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit and try to keep it brief because you have no idea how fascinating the person who's coming after me is. He's really brilliant. So I'll try and keep it short. A little bit about the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, in case you don't know our organization. We're part of a network of 28 national estuary programs around the country. We're funded by EPA, and we were established back in 1996 or so. We are guided by a governance structure that's really interesting. It includes federal agencies, state agencies, municipalities, NGOs like Friends of Casco Bay. We have businesses, we have a realtor who's on our board, and that group is charged with telling us what the priorities are for Casco Bay. And so we use our funds according to those priorities, and they're expressed by the Casco Bay Plan. The Casco Bay Plan was last updated in 2024, and one of the priorities in the plan is basically an all-hands-on-deck effort to try and build resilience in Casco Bay's tidal marshes. And it's not just happening here in Casco Bay, it's happening across the state of Maine. But we are at a unique moment in time when there really is, the marshes are certainly at risk and threatened. Geoff and I will talk about that some more. But we're really looking at trying to restore not the marsh back to the condition it was in 100 years ago or 500 years ago, but restore natural processes. Things like flooding, draining, sediment transport, nutrient movement, basics, right? And those, if we get those things right, then the marshes will have the best chance to survive the future, which includes the perils of sea level rise. I think everybody understands that marshes are important, right? They're terrific habitat. They sequester carbon. They are a buffer against flooding. They absorb floodwaters. There are numerous reasons why marshes are important. They're incredibly productive ecosystems. Long Marsh is a great example of that. There's a really rich shellfish bed, which unfortunately is closed right now because of water quality considerations, but there's all kinds of life that moves in and out of the marsh with the tides. They're very, very productive. So I've already talked about this a little bit, but a lot of the fundamental parts of the marsh that need to happen are related to tidal exchange. And so at Long Marsh, as you may know, there is a dike, which is now a road, it's called Long Reach Lane, that for a long time controlled the movement of water in and out of the marsh. We need to restore that full exchange of tides in order to get those natural processes working again. So if you haven't actually been out to Long Marsh, I wanted to give you a sense for just how long it is. And unfortunately, the display here that I set up doesn't really work very well, but it's actually about 1.6 or 1.7 miles long. It's a long, narrow fluvial minor marsh, we call it. So it's at one end, at the north end, it's a part of Doughty Cove. It's basically tidal mud flats. And then at the southern end, it's a tidal wetland. And it's unique, fairly unique in Casco Bay because it drains to the north. So to get back to Casco Bay, critters and water has to move north. That also means that the marsh is very exposed to certain northeastern weather events, right? So it's a really dynamic place, especially in the winter. So here's a view from a drone photo by Dan Devereaux, looking up north into Doughty Cove. In the foreground, you can see the dike, and it traverses the entire marsh. You can also see the new culvert that was installed in 2014. And then here's a shot to the south, and you can see just how long and narrow the marsh is. These photos were taken, I think, in 2018, so fairly long after the culvert was replaced. We don't know, or I don't know, much about the history of the marsh until about the early 1900s, when we have this wonderful resource, Lost Paradise, which is basically an autobiography by a former president of Bowdoin College, Tristram Coffin. The name of the book is Lost Paradise. And there's just wonderful anecdotes in there about his experiences growing up on this farm, on the Salt Marsh Farm. And if you look at this picture, you can see all kinds of interesting features. On the left, you can see the dike, and you can see that there's a horse pulling hay, a pile of hay up Misery Hill. There's a skinny dipper in there, which makes it fun. You can see the hunting. It's just and the book itself has all kinds of really interesting anecdotes. I remember one anecdote was that Doughty Cove was full of eelgrass. I don't know if there's any eelgrass in Doughty Cove now, but his anecdotes were that there was eelgrass there. He talks about sea-run fish coming up to the dike and trying to get upstream. We know that historically there were rainbow smelt in that system. I don't know what else, but so it's just a really rich, interesting sort of accompaniment to what Geoff's going to talk about. And then this is a picture on the top. You might recognize if you've got really good eyes, Reed Cole. Reed is standing on top of the culvert, the old culvert, with Vanessa Levesque, who was working at the time for the town of Brunswick. And so this was back in 2009. This is a site that we knew had a tidal restriction. We knew there were a lot of impacts to the adjacent marsh. And so over the span of many years, Harpswell Heritage Land Trust and other partners worked to get this site replaced. Ultimately, it was funded through a wetland mitigation project that Maine DOT had to run for mitigating impacts to marsh, to wetlands down in the Presumpscot River. But basically, this culvert was replaced in 2014 in January. They took a 3-foot round pipe that was very high in the tidal range, impounded a lot of water upstream, and replaced it with this 6x12 concrete box culvert, which you can walk through now. And so that did a tremendous amount to change and basically restore natural tidal hydrology to the marsh to the south, which is upstream. Our organization was hired to do the monitoring for that in order to demonstrate to the permitting agencies that, yes, indeed, the project did what it was supposed to do. And lo and behold, DOT got their mitigation credits in 2018. In the meantime, myself, my supervisor, Curtis Bolin, numerous interns have been coming out to the marsh for 12, 13, 14 years now, collecting vegetation data, channel data, hydrology data, salinity data. We're looking at invasive species. There's now a lot of other science that's starting to happen out there. People looking at carbon sequestration, methane emissions, and it's just a really rich, well-studied site, and has served as a bit of a launching pad for some other restoration efforts and monitoring efforts in Maine. So just real quick, I'm not going to try and get into too much of the data, but essentially these two graphs, the one on the bottom shows what the water levels were like before the culvert was replaced. The one on the top shows afterward. And if you look closely, you can see that the tides are nearly synchronized, after the culvert was replaced. And that was basically the project goal. That basically means that upstream, there's more flooding, and ideally also enough drainage out of the marsh. This is a little bit tricky to decipher from afar, but what we saw with vegetation was basically a conversion of a pretty rich marsh that had a lot of cattails, had a lot of freshwater loving plants, a lot of brackish plants, to a marsh that essentially became much less interesting because it was mostly saltwater vegetation, salt tolerant vegetation. And that's not surprising. My boss gets bored when he does the monitoring now because there are only 10 or 15 species he sees, but that's kind of what it should be, right? Because the right ones, exactly. However, it took a long time for vegetation to come back in, and we were a little concerned about it. It's very hard to read this set of graphs, but one of the things we saw immediately, if you look at the graph in the lower right, so we went from having very little dead plant material out there to suddenly every plot had a lot of dead plant material. And it was like that for the entire duration of our monitoring. We also saw a steady increase in the amount of standing water that was out in the marsh. Every single year it got wetter and wetter. And we started to get really concerned, like, what did we do here? Or what did DOT do, right? Wasn't my fault. This is just to give you an example of exactly how much it changed. So this is actually the Salt Hay Preserve, which is a recent acquisition of Harpswell Heritage Land Trust. And you can see back in 2013, before the culvert was replaced, you're looking at basically a monoculture stand of cattails. Then fast forward to 2026, just a couple weeks ago, and you can see that there are still some cattails, but only right up next to the edge where there's some freshwater runoff down to the marsh. And all the dead standing woody trees and shrubs, or all the standing woody trees and shrubs are dead. And they were basically dead, right after the salt came back in. Some of those plants, trees like white pines, are very sensitive to salt.
And
So
this was all natural process. There was no restoration done on this.
nope, there was no proactive effort to try and change any of the vegetation other than alteration of the tidal regime. So I always think it's important to raise, it's not just about the ecosystem, it's also about the people, right? We need to think about resilience comprehensively. And unfortunately, when the culvert was replaced, the road was not raised. So as a result, and also in combination of the fact that it's exposed to the northeast during the winter, the road does overtop now quite a bit. And from my understanding, this is something that started happening with more frequency right about the time that the culvert was replaced. So what ended up happening, if you look at the photo on the lower right, is that there was a lot more water getting delivered into the marsh. And for some reason, which we didn't understand at the time, the water wasn't leaving the marsh. And so all that standing water ended up creating large dead areas or bare areas. And that was very concerning to us because it seemed like the restoration was incomplete, to put it mildly, and in need of adaptive management. So that brings us to today. Through a combination of partnership efforts, grant writing, etc., and with the support of the town and the land trust, we have managed to get some funding together to do some restoration work, which is really, again, very focused on restoring natural processes. And in this case, what we're really focused on, I think, is getting the right drainage. So we let all this water in with the culvert replacement, but now we need to make sure that the water can get out of the marsh. And there are several things that Geoff will talk about in that regard, but there are also still some flow restrictions that are out there, one of which is right next to the Salt Hay Preserve. This is an old roadbed, or we call it the ford, which is basically a large pile of rocks in the channel and creates a dam. It creates an impoundment, so there's a lot of fresh water that's stuck in the southern part of the marsh. Part of the plan is to take that out, and we think that we're going to find some more. Geoff is going to talk about the surface hydrology restoration work, so I want to try and get into that. But I did want to acknowledge not only the Land Trust and the town are key partners in this project, but we also have Geoff, which is great, and Maine Coast Heritage Trust, which is the grant recipient and wrote the proposal. Tatia Bauer couldn't be here today. Baxter State Park Authority is a partner on this project, and we are too, and probably I'm missing some people. But I have to say, I was really thrilled to hear Matt say, and in talking with Emma, heard her say too, that there's a real hope that the Austin Carey lot might convey to the Land Trust. For me, that would be a dream come true, and so I hope it happens, fingers crossed. So really tonight, I think the focus is on the agricultural legacy and the impacts that the agricultural uses of the marsh are having today on the marsh, and the ability of the marsh to keep pace with sea level rise. So reclaiming salt marshes was a common practice here in Casco Bay, in this region. And there are many marshes all around us. You go to the head of McCoy Bay, go to Buttermilk Cove, Mare Brook, the Cousins Marsh over in Yarmouth and Freeport, Thomas Bay Marsh at the head of Thomas Bay. All over the place, you see these agricultural modifications. And the good news is that there are partnerships in place, just like this one, with different partners to restore the surface hydrology, to try and get the drainage right, to try and optimize the vegetation growth. And it really is an all hands on deck moment. And Geoff, I think we'll probably talk a little bit about why. But with accelerating sea level rise, there's a unique moment in time that we have to try and get the hydrology fixed so that the vegetation can start growing robustly, start building that peat, and the marsh can start keeping up with sea level rise. So with that, I'll just say thank you and hand it over to Geoff. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or if you'd like to follow up. Like I said, I'm up here all the time, so I'm always happy to meet folks and talk about the work.
Matt, I have a quick question. Is the culvert where you turn in where the Harpswell Auto Sales used to be?
Exactly.
You just turn in there and you go a little ways and that's where the...
Yeah, and you come to an opening over the marsh.
Thank
Yes,
you.
that's where the culvert is. There's great striped bass fishing. There's a bass that likes to hang out under the culvert on the incoming outgoing tide, so it's really fun to watch.
So I'm Geoff. I'm one of the members of the restoration team. And as Matt mentioned, there's a lot of folks working on this restoration project itself. And we also work with other restoration teams from down East Maine all the way to Long Island, New York. And the group that we work with is called the Salt Marsh Adaptation and Resiliency Teams. And we started off in the, actually the early 90s, just kind of working together on restoration projects. And then sometime around 2000 or so, we started to recognize these changes in the marsh that were dramatic. And the marshes were getting more standing water on the surface of the marsh. And as a team, we came together and we said, all right, so what's happening here? What's going on? And through this process, we sort of rediscovered these lost agricultural techniques that were used in the salt marsh, and then recognized that, the light bulb went off. Oh, this is secondary succession. We can use this. And so what I'd like to do is be able to kind of explain some of these lost agricultural practices and how they're affecting the marshes and the marshes' ability to adapt to sea level rise. And so one of the fun things to start off with every talk is just kind of looking at these as typical areas that you'd see in any salt marsh, and sort of recognizing that they're really not the natural salt marsh or the pre-colonial salt marsh. And so recognizing that these are actually all signatures of secondary succession. So these are agricultural relic or impairments that are left in the marsh, and the salt marsh is having a hard time adapting to the rising sea levels, and these impairments that are left in the marsh are causing these obstructions. And so one of the things that we did is we kind of went back through and looked at the history of salt marshes. And so if you can see in this image here, these are salt hay staddles, and the way that the farmers used to harvest the marsh, store it out in the marsh so that they could come back out when the marsh was frozen and bring the hay back in. And so each one of these sort of stacks of hay has an enormous amount of hay in it. You can see the gentleman standing there for a reference, and another gentleman standing on top. And when we look out, this is the Plum Island marshes in Newbury from the Parker River itself. When we look out and count how many hay staddles there are out there, there's over 68 that you can identify as an actual hay staddle. And then a lot of other sort of shadows that you would think, well, those probably are. And so when we look at that, we can really see that this was a landscape level effort where the entire salt marsh was put into agricultural production. And then it just stopped.
Jeff, did you say, you call those staddles?
Yeah, staddles. So
S-T-A-D-D-L-E.
yeah.
Never heard of that word.
And what they are is they're cedar posts
Okay.
that are probably 3 to 4 feet in length, and they drive them into the marsh
Okay.
in a ring that's about 20 feet in diameter. And as one of my former lives, I was actually a salt hay farmer, and we saw one get removed, and the part that was below the marsh was about 3 feet, in length, and it was about 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Looked like it just got driven in a year or so ago. It was actually dated, and I forget the exact date with the farmer's name, but it was in the 1800s, and the top had just like withered away.
Unbelievable.
But it
Is
was
there a platform on top of the posts?
no, they don't actually use a platform. They weave the hay.
They weave it in.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work.
Well, it's a lot of work, and it tells you about the productivity of the marsh back then. So when we look out in marshes now, we see the salt hay Spartina patens, and it's generally less than 12 inches in height. And we estimate that to be less than 1 ton per acre yield of hay. Now, when the farmers first started farming the marsh, the old agricultural journals say that a regular marsh had about 1 ton per acre yield of hay. And then when they started these these practices that we're going to go over here, they would increase that hay yield up to 2 tons per acre or 3 tons per acre. So it was a significant increase in hay yield. And the way they did that was they made the grasses grow much taller. And so there are a few places in Massachusetts where we can still find up to 2 tons per acre of salt hay, and it's over your knee. And it's just it's an effort to walk through it.
What was the impact of the salt content on the cattle? Could they eat that and tolerate it?
Yeah, so the cattle didn't have a problem with it, and there's a couple of different types of grasses that the farmers were looking for. So there's the broadleaf grass, Spartina alterniflora, cordgrass, smooth cordgrass, grows kind of in the low marsh, grows in the wetter areas. That actually draws the salt up with water as it's growing, and then it exudes the salt on the exterior of the leaf. And that was less favorable as a salt hay product, but what they would do is they'd harvest that and use that as insulation around the base of their buildings, and then they would manure their fields with it in the spring. The real grasses that they were looking for were Spartina patens, which is called salt hay grass, and black grass, which is Juncus gerardi, and that's those were really high quality salt hay grasses that didn't draw in the salt, so they weren't salty, and the cows would eat it readily, and then oxen would eat it as well, but horses were kind of finicky. Some horses ate it, some horses didn't, but they were mainly looking for it for just fodder. And then in the sort of the reclamation era, which Matt was describing. So what we sort of discovered is that there were actually 2 different eras of agricultural productivity in salt marshes. So the first era was the salt marsh hay era, and what they did was they sort of they came in. The marshes originally had what we call single channel hydrology, so that all the the water that would come into an area of the marsh would come through that single channel, flood the marsh, and then exit out of that single channel. And that's really important to the restoration processes that we do today. And then when the farmers came in and put the marshes under production, they dug ditches, and that fractured that single channel hydrology. And so when you went from single channel hydrology to multi-channel hydrology and parallel hydrology, that sort of started this decline in the salt marshes. And then eventually in the 1800s, they used a second practice called reclamation, where they built these really large earthen embankments to totally block out the salt hay. And so we can actually go into the marshes today, and we can locate these relics and see how that they're impairing the marsh. And so what we call the first period around the 1700s is just the early period, because we don't really have the exact dates on it. And so the marshes were quartered, so think of quartering a C, across the marsh, kitty corner, and they used the material to create small earthen embankments, and they had water control structures with a flapper valve, and the hinge was actually made with leather. And so this was the earliest practice that we're aware of. And they would then increase the salt hay yield from 1 ton per acre up to as much as 3 tons per acre. So the way that we can kind of interpret that is marshes had a slope. They went kitty corner across the slope, and they terraced the salt marsh. So the lowest terraces they brought up to 2 tons per acre of salt hay. Sort of the upper terraces were 3 tons per acre of salt hay. And so when we go into the marshes today, we can find these kitty corner sort of embankments as they go across the marsh. Sort of some of the impairment, right, in this location here and this location here that we're now seeing readily visible in the marsh. So when the farmers were farming it, it was all this grass right here across these whole areas. And upon abandonment and with sea level rise, the marsh appearance is changing. And then around the 1800s or so, the agricultural journals start talking about new practices, and they call this reclamation, reclaiming the marshes. And so they would put in higher, larger earthen embankments, specifically sort of at the outer edges of the marshes, and they would continue the rectilinear ditching that we see today to terrace the marsh back up. And so what they would get is sort of that they would change the 2 ton per acre salt hay areas to 3 tons per acre, so they significantly increased it again. And then the 3 ton per acre salt hay areas, they would change completely to freshwater areas, and they would grow 4 tons per acre of English hay, which is the highest quality hay even today. And then they would also grow other fodder crops like mangel wurzel. So whoever heard of that? But it's a fodder beet that's slightly salt tolerant. And so they would get up to 16 bushels per acre of mangel wurzel. And so it was really important to them to be able to use these areas for agriculture. And so when we go out into the marshes today, say, all right, we know they're out there. We know that they had these specific components involved with them. Can we still find them? And as it turns out, we can. And so it was a combined effort. So you see the sort of the blue dotted lines on the right. Those were the reclamation embankments. So those were the fresh areas that were, growing the better quality crops. And then the red would be sort of the extension of the salt hay embankments. So 3 tons per acre of hay, salt hay here, 4 tons per acre of English hay here with winter pasture. And then one of the most important things to note about this, they used larger embankments. In Long Marsh, those embankments have a high clay content. And as with sea level rise, you can see that the pools, which we call mega pools, are associated into the spaces in between. So these embankments that are there are altering the hydrology, and combined with the loss of channelized hydrology, are creating these pools where basically the grasses die and the marsh elevation is lost. And so we tried to sort of understand, once we identified it as secondary succession, we tried to understand what was going on with secondary succession, how we can use it in the restoration plan itself, because secondary succession is relatively predictable once you identify it, and then you can advance it or you can regress it as your needs require. And so here's an example that we found down in Connecticut, and it's called Leeds Island, I'm sorry. And it's a 1917 photo here, where the marsh was still under production, being farmed, and then the 2006 after abandonment. So it's a long period of time, but we can follow it over time and watch these changes occur. So one of the first things we had to do is we had to identify sort of the agricultural components that are here to understand, how they're affecting the marshes today. And so when we take it apart and we look at it, we can see we can still find the embankments from the 1800s. So you have sort of the outer embankments, or what we're referring to as the outer embankments. Then we have the inner embankments, and you can see how it's terracing the marsh. So the marsh slope is going down. This is the upper terrace. This is the next terrace down. This is the third terrace. So think productivity changes in each terrace as it goes down.
Put a lot of engineering into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they also had 5 different types of ditching structures on the inside of the reclamation embankments. So, each system had these same components, these ditching components, but they used them differently according to the land. And so we have the marginal ditch. This was always in between the upland edge and the marsh itself. We had drainage ditches that would go down to the slope. We had cross ditches that were a source of material, like a borrow ditch, to create the terracing embankments on the interior embankments. Then we had the trunk ditch, which was also a borrow ditch for the exterior embankments. And the trunk ditch would have the water control structure. And so by now they actually had improved the water control structure away from the leather hinge. They had basically a box culvert with a vertical flapper valve. So as the tide came in, the wood would float up and seal up against the hole and prevent the water from entering into the marsh.
And these ditches all dug by hand?
All dug by hand, yeah. They had in the journals they have an estimate for how many men you would need to dig X number of feet of embankment a day.
A lot of work.
Yeah, it is. But they didn't have TVs.
Or the internet.
Right. And so this is, again, we can trace this back and see that it was a practice that was, a communal farming practice that was done across the entire marsh, every marsh. And we've only found 3 marshes in the Western Hemisphere that we can't find these signatures in, which is amazing. One's in Virginia, one's in Honduras, and one's in Alaska. So basically, from this understanding of agriculture, the abandonment of the sort of the land, so that forms the disturbance, we can understand how the land is recovering naturally on its own, and then we can speed that process up. And so this is a sort of a diagram that explains secondary succession, and it's tied to sea level rise. So the marshes are not necessarily this black line is where the marshes are supposed to be to keep up with sea level rise over time. And so after abandonment, about 30 years after the ditches stop being maintained, the marshes start to go into decline and the grasses change. That's because the zone of saturation is rising up. And after decline goes on for a period of time, eventually all the grasses will die, form those open water areas we call megapools. And then we lose elevation in the marsh rapidly, usually 8 to 12 inches. And then after sort of the megapool, think of megapool as smaller pools that combine to make larger and larger pools. After a period of time, it gets enough potential energy stored up in that water that it will breach and drain the pool. And at that point, the secondary succession takes a really interesting twist. So there's 2 interesting twists with salt marsh secondary succession. One is that the first 2 stages are actually decline stages. So we don't usually see that in ecosystems. What we normally see is sort of a fire comes through, kills all the trees, the grasses start, then the forbs, then the shrubs, and it's all just the whole habitat itself going in an upward progression towards the climactic community. In salt marshes, because of the agricultural impairments, the first 2 stages are actually the marsh falling apart so that it can rebuild itself, because it has to change that surface hydrology. It has to change in order for the plants to grow.
So left to its own devices without man's interference,
Yep.
these marshes will heal themselves and rise
Yes.
as the sea level rises
Yes,
by
but
building up organic matter.
they will, and that's what they're supposed to do. The problem is sea level rise is going faster than they can adapt, and that's why we need to intervene. If you look at this process, our photo history, which is where we can read this out of, is about 90 years long, the air photo history. And there are areas that, still haven't changed over that 90-year history. And there's large portions of the marsh that haven't gone through these changes yet. So what we want to do is kind of get in there first, make these changes so it doesn't go through the crash and lose elevation that it has to regain.
So the marsh, like Scarborough, the marsh would gradually move inland if it was able to do that.
Ooh.
Or you would lose marsh.
Right, and so both of those processes are correct. These marshes will move in, but you will lose all the marshes or a large portion of the marshes that we have now.
Yeah.
If we can correct the platform hydrology, we'll be able to save those marshes as well, a large portion of them. And so after the breach in the subsidence basin, what will happen is the pool basin itself will start to revegetate, and then that revegetation process puts below ground biomass into the soil, fluffing it up, building it up in elevation, as well as the plants trap sediments and hold the sediments, continuing that building process. Now, this is the second unique aspect of salt marshes, is that there's a regression cycle that frequently occurs and mostly occurs in this breach stage right here. And I've got some other images of it, but basically what happens is the grasses grow, they close the opening, and it goes back into pool. And there's a lot of that at Long Marsh, so I've included a lot of images of that. And then, if what's called the stable framework, so the channelized hydrology that forms is stable, then the marsh will continue to grow and heal and will progress without going through those regression cycles. And so because of that that randomized process, we think of it as a randomized process, and it's based on the underlying agricultural infrastructure. So when these breaches occur, it happens in the old ditching infrastructure that was from the 17 and 1800s, which is incredible. And so here's some closer pictures of the decline phase. So you can see that there's a loss of vegetation, and some small areas of shallow standing water, thin lenses and things. It's not very unique, it's very common in the marshes these days. And that's what it looks like in the ground, on the ground. You can see that there's plants trying to survive, but they're kind of getting waterlogged and they're starting to die back. That water area is getting larger and larger. And then the next stage, the subsidence stage, is the next stage on, where the areas start to lose all of its vegetation, starts to hold a lot more water. And this is early in that process where you can still see the individual pools that are coming together to make the mega pool. As that process continues before it breaches, this will all become one large pool with a uniform bottom. And that's when all that potential energy is able to release itself and focus on an opening. And this is kind of what it looks like in the field. Got the larger pools growing in size. And then in the breach area, the area to the left is regression. So this area breached at one point in time, a channel did not incise. The channel grew over, and then it started to become wet again and holding water again. And so this is what it looks like in the field. You can see the stubble of old plants that were here not too long ago alive, and now it's starting to waterlog and they're starting to die off again. And then this is a picture of the stable framework. And so this is moving forward, it's stable. You can see these straight segments. Those straight segments are all old ditching infrastructure from the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s. And then these janky corners are where it's going from one layer or one ditching infrastructure layer, churning and taking into another one. And so it gets that jagged corner look. Eventually it will look like a normal creek that you wouldn't suspect was artificial, or was influenced by the ditching infrastructure. And this is what it looks like on that recovery phase. So you can see this is the channel, this is the channel, and the grasses are actually growing up around that channel. And that's really important to understanding the stable framework. So the grasses are not only growing there, they're not only growing the elevation of the soil, but they're growing around these hydrological pathways that have enough flow to maintain themselves as open. That's why they're stable. And so here's another look at it so we can look at regression and understand sort of regression a little better. And so no stable framework, it goes regression, stable framework, long-term stability, and then so it starts off with a pool. The pool breaches, you have a channel, you start to get vegetation growing on the inside, the vegetation grows over that channel, and the pool reforms. It's kind of simple, but it takes 40 years to happen, so you have to have that photo history to be able to identify it. And so one of the things that once we understood secondary succession and understood that this was probably going to be a big part of how we restore marshes and restore resiliency in marshes, we had to sort of, as a team, come together and develop a restoration methodology around that. And so this is sort of that methodology. And so the first step is to stabilize the marshes, right? We want to stop that loss of elevation. We want to create a stable platform for the plants to start growing back from and restoring the elevations that are lost. So when you think about it, if the plants are losing elevation due to subsidence every year, they also have to regain that elevation just to maintain their sort of position relative to sea level. And so we want to stabilize it so that all of the accretion that occurs with the plants, which is as much as 5 millimeters with Spartina alterniflora, 4.4 millimeters with Spartina patens, they're not using that accretion that they get annually to regain elevation that they just lost in the last year. And so that's really important. And then once we've stabilized the marsh platform, then what we do is we look to increase plant productivity. So in New England, the majority of salt marshes have about 80% organic matter produced by the plants in trapping of organic sediments, and about 20% inorganic sediments that wash in with storms and things. So we know that the plants, the below ground biomass, those live roots of the plants going down into the soil play a big part in that elevation or maintaining the elevation. So if we can get the plants back up to that 1 ton per acre productivity that they had pre-colonial farming, then that corresponds with a 5 times greater amount of below ground biomass going into the soil annually. So for every 1 ton of above ground biomass, we'll have 5 tons of below ground biomass going into the soil. And so not all of it will stay, but the portions that are resistant to decay will stay in the soil and help rebuild that elevation that's been lost.
So presumably you're not allowed to harvest salt hay anymore in these marshes.
No, but we use it for the restoration process,
Sure.
And I'll get over that.
But you need the vegetation.
Yeah, the vegetation is a big part. And so the third tier is, once we've stabilized the marsh, once we've increased that productivity, then we start thinking about other benefits for the marsh, like wildlife management considerations, things like that. And so it's really salt marsh sparrows up in this area, but there are a lot of other species that can benefit through restoring, stabilizing, and increasing salt marsh resiliency. And then the fourth tier is we don't want to step away from the marshes again. So we want to be able to monitor them. We want to be able to do adaptive management in the future. We want to be able to make sure that that stable framework stays in place so that the marshes have the ability to regain that elevation that's been lost. And so these are the 3 main techniques that we use to restore the platform hydrology. The one on the left here is called small channel hydrology. And we take areas where the zone of saturation is too high in the soil column and is saturating the marshes. And we control that zone of saturation in the groundwater by putting in a small channel that is sort of V-shaped. And then on the right here is how we get rid of the existing ditches that are in the marshes. So we call that ditch remediation. So if you have a large ditch, you can see that groundwater is discharging along this whole surface, along the whole ditch. And what we do is we harvest the salt hay and we bring that ditch floor up so that we can control the groundwater and bring it just below the live root zone of the plants. So when you think about it, it's a up-down management style or bottom-up management style. And so closer look at this, ditch remediation. Essentially, we harvest the salt hay that's adjacent to the ditch. We rake it. Then we put it into the ditch. We sort of braid it as it goes so it forms like a rope. And then we secure it with sisal twine and stakes. So that becomes part of the restoration effort. We don't have to go and pull out the poly rope or anything like that afterwards. And then with small channel hydrology, essentially we're using a small excavator on weight dispersal mats, gets down to about 1/2 pound per square inch, and then we can dig these, these narrow, shallow trenches to control the groundwater below the live roots zone. And so kind of, angles like that. And one of the important things with this is we are actually following the ditching patterns that were already in the marsh. So we're not impacting marsh peat that was not ditched through before. We're following the old ditches. And then we take the material that we dig out when we're maintaining the ditches and we create marsh habitat islands. And so this is kind of a neat one right here. So if you can see, there's a blue flag here, and you see all this unvegetated area here. So this is, sort of late decline, where the marsh is starting to lose the vegetation. You can see it had a little bit of standing water right here, but it hasn't collapsed yet. So we intervened with small channel hydrology. We took the material, we created an island here, and this is the same image 2 years later. It's a little bit off. The blue flag is about right here, but you can see the entire area in 2 years is revegetated. And so it's starting that process where it's regrowing. One of the interesting things too is to see the cedar tree right here. It didn't really like it. So it's starting to die back, decline, but that's part of marsh migration. And when the water was being held in place there, it was backing up the freshwater hydrology. And so when we released the hydrology in the marsh, it allowed that freshwater hydrology to sort of drain down a little bit, and then the cedar tree was impacted. And so this is the long marsh area, and as Matt was mentioning, that it's so big that I couldn't get the whole image on. So this is most of it, but I can go through sort of the agricultural history here, and I've got a few slides in the back that go through regression, and the regression part is really interesting. And so, I don't know if you can see it, it's not showing up well. The early period embankments, you can kind of see them in the larger marsh areas that have not formed pools. Basically, kitty corner across the marsh. The red ones are the late period embankments. And so this again is terracing the marsh in that rectilinear pattern. And here's a close-up of it, so you can see that it went all the way across the marsh, narrow marsh. They would have water control structures frequently along this pathway. And so if you think of it, it's terraces from the upland edge down to the low point at the creek, and same in the opposite direction. And then this is a sort of a close-up of the embankments that go along the creek. So there's very large embankments with high clay contents that go right along the edge of the creek. Those are the outer embankments.
So this soil came from elsewhere, it wasn't part of the marsh itself?
Well, no, there's probably, in some areas they do that. You're correct in assuming that. But what we find is that the embankment is more of a clay core in it. And we didn't really find the clay core in these embankments. What we found was embankments that had a high clay content mixed out in throughout them. So chances are that, it was material that was used from there, it just has a high clay content in it. And then this is a sort of an image of the combined techniques. So it's mostly small channel hydrology, but there's a few areas where we're suggesting using ditch remediation just to kind of correct what would be considered errors that would lead to regression. And so if we fix the regression before it happens, we can stabilize it and it won't occur. And then this is another image of sort of the stable expression itself when you look at it all together. So this would be the new channelized hydrology for this portion of the long marsh. And so this is sort of the end slide, but I've got some close-ups, and I don't know if anybody's interested in this stuff. I'm kind of nerdy like that. But this is a picture, some close-ups of the regression patterns that we find in long marsh. So remember that clay, high clay content embankment that runs along the creeks. So that's right there. And you can see it on the other side as well. And you can see this is a large pool, long pool that's formed in 1996. right? And so this is the mega pool. So it starts off as 1 pool, 2 pools, 3 pools, 4 pools, all together. It's kind of getting uniform, it's ready to breach. 2003, it's breached, right? So this is before the culvert even. And you can see it's just one long pool that goes all the way down to here, but it's made up of a few different little basins. 2010, jump ahead a little ways, this is that regression that's occurring. So the vegetation's closing off this portion of the pool, it's starting to reform. And this pool right here, you can see the channels are incising, creating better growing conditions, but it hasn't quite vegetated yet. 2012, much of the same. So this area is really becoming isolated. You can hardly see any channelized pathway here. There's actually a new channelized pathway that's forming here. And you can see that the edges are growing in. So Spartina alterniflora is growing in from the edges, sort of filling the pool. And then 2014, again the same, very isolated now. We can see a lot of vegetation inside the pool, but we can see the vegetation is crossing right next to the creek. So this new creek that's forming, really good growing conditions. The plants are growing like gangbusters, isolating a second pool right there. And then another pool is starting to form back here. 2016, now this is something I didn't have time to get into. There's a 18.6 year lunar cycle called the Metonic cycle. And so think about it as the moon, the earth, and the sun. And when they're in full alignment, that's the minor lunar standstill. And the tides are at their highest, they flood the marsh most frequently, there's the most water abundant. Now that tends to be a catalyst for these changes as they occur. Now, 9.3 years from that point, the moon is 5 degrees out of that alignment order, that direct alignment order. That's called the northern or the southern lunar standstill. And the interesting thing is that in December of 2024 was the northern lunar standstill. So the next 10 years, the tides are going to get more and more, the marshes are going to get wetter and wetter as it goes back to the minor lunar standstill. So I always like to point that out. And you can see that sort of the changes are still occurring. The creek's getting wider. Maybe a little bit of connectivity is resprouting in here because it's getting wetter. But it's still continuing to vegetate and just kind of close this off. One of the important things here too, I forgot to mention this, is remember how the vegetation was getting thicker and thicker here. It's created so much resistance that the channel is straightening through. So it's creating that oxbow right there. So it's going to cut that section off and just kind of reroute there. And that's because the channel edge here has grown high enough that it's a boundary when the area starts to flood. So that channelized hydrology has to move through that area of marsh and then go to the right. In 2021, you can really see that the pools are starting to reform. So this is a high tide image. You can see that there's a pool here, there's a pool that's forming here. See the really sort of wet area there, really wet area there, really wet area there. So that's regression. It's going backwards in secondary succession to start over again and go forward another time. If you look across the creek, the same thing is happening here. It's the same process, just a little later. And so when we go forward, we see it. You can see that it's isolated into segments again. It will reform pools, and then this area is following in its footsteps where it's got the breach and it's starting to sort of have connectivity through this channel here. And we'll go through that same breach, revegetate, and regression cycle without intervention. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
After the restoration,
Yep.
the forecast is we're going to get another couple feet of sea level rise by the end of the century.
Yep.
Will this marsh be able to heal itself, grow, expand in a healthy manner, or is it still going to be handicapped by these 300-year-old structures?
Well, we're going to address the structures that are in the marsh. The road and the opening may, find a period where it is not able to be sufficient again.
Right.
But what the sort of the hope is with single channel hydrology is it makes the marsh much more resilient to the sea level rises. And so there's some science behind it, even though there's very few sort of examples of that. One of the best examples is the location down in Virginia. It's called Mockhorn Island Wildlife Management Area. And it has a history, a known history, that it was almost always hunting camps out there. It's kind of a large marsh. And then in the 1950s, an investment banker from New York bought it, tried to farm it, and failed. Now, the habitat signatures in this marsh are the same single channel hydrology that we're restoring to Long Marsh. And the interesting thing is that during that 90-year photo history, where every marsh on the East Coast is going through similar secondary successional patterns that we saw at Long Marsh, that Mockhorn Island Wildlife Management Area is the only marsh that we're aware of on the East Coast that's stable, doesn't go through any of these patterns. And so what the thoughts are is that as these changes are occurring, the vegetation just kind of shifts to meet the hydrology that's there, but because there's still channelized hydrology, the plants always survive. And so the salt marsh plants are kind of unique for a wetland plant. They really need some aerated soil at the surface of the marsh in order to survive. They have the ability to translocate oxygen from the atmosphere to their roots, which is what wetland plants need to survive, but they gave it up to escape competition when they went out into the salt marshes. So they have it, just doesn't function well. Doesn't function well enough to survive saturated conditions. And so when we control the zone of saturation, bring it down below their root zone, that's when they're happiest, that's when they'll grow the best. And as long as that channelized hydrology sort of maintains itself, the plants will grow and that channelized hydrology will grow with it. Okay. And so if as long as that maintains itself, the idea is that the marshes will be able to maintain themselves. Now, this wild card is that sea level rise has a variable rate. And so we know that we can restore the marshes and have Spartina patens as one of the top species in the marsh. But say sea level rise comes faster than Spartina patens can change, what will happen is the marsh vegetation will shift to Spartina alterniflora. Spartina alterniflora can grow the marsh at a faster rate, up to 18 millimeters a year, so it can keep up with a lot of sea level rise. Plus it has a growth range that, help me out, in this area it's probably 4 feet low marsh range.
You're talking about relative to the tidal datums?
Yeah. So
yeah, like 4.25 to 4.46.
Okay. So if sea level rise comes fast enough that it shifts the marsh platform to the low marsh elevation, there's still another 4 feet or so of sort of range that the marsh grasses will be able to keep up before sea level rise washes them out. So it's a wider game.
God help us if we hit 4 feet.
Well, yeah. True enough.
Thank you.
And if there's no more questions, thank you for
Fascinating.
sitting through.